Yo, today I'm going to teach you guys how to make this growing grape bunch in GeoNodes. It's a little bit complicated, more complicated than the last few tutorials for GeoNodes. Again, the project file will be in the description down below, so you can download that, study off of it if you need. And before I get started, I just want to show you guys a couple of variations that I made from fruits using the same methods I did for the grapes. Fruits like blueberries, cherries, raspberries, strawberries, and olives. So there's an extra 5. The grapes will be free in the description, so you guys can study off those if you want or use them. There's no license on any of them. And the other 5, I'll be putting them on my Blender Market. All of these are based off curves, so you can just draw them however you want with the curve editor. All the fruitlets will still grow off of the branch, and everything's animatable. There's growth properties, leaf rotation, branch rotation, the amount of berries and the amount of leaves. There's a bunch of different values that you can change for animating them, and they all have realistic textures. The leaves are generated off Midjourney, so none of them have licensing. They're not physically based, so some of them will collide, but it's pretty easy to get rid of that just by changing the camera angle or just changing the rotation for each berry. You can kind of get them to rotate away from each other. So the link for all these will be in the description, as well as the free grape project that we're doing on the tutorial right now. So we'll get started on the grapes. We're going to need something as the grape object. So I'm going to use a UV sphere, and I'm just going to go into edit mode here and scale it along the Z-axis. And then I'm just going to bring the whole thing down on the Z-axis. So it's going to be on the center rotation point. Now if we rotate it and scale it, it's all off that point. Top faces up here. I'm just going to press I and bring them up a bit. This will just be the little nub that the grape is going to grow from. Something simple like that for now is good. I'm going to hide that. And to get started for the branch, we're going to use a Bezier. So we can draw it with this curve guide over here and do whatever kind of pattern we want. With the grapes though, the way that all the branches come out, you're going to want to go into edit mode and just make sure the curve is on an angle or facing down. If you just have it flat like this, I'll show you later, but the branches won't come off in the right spot. Open up a GeoNodes here, and we're going to start off with a resample curve. Let us adjust the resolution of the curve, and I'll go curve to mesh and set curve radius, and I'll add a curve circle too. So you can see if you plug that in, you'll get a bit of thickness, and we'll adjust that later. So I'm going to add in a Bezier curve through the actual GeoNodes tab. So if you click Shift and Alt and then left click between nodes, lets you preview them. I'm just going to turn this end value down to 0. So now you can see it's going to grow out of that center point. With the start and end handle, if you adjust them just a bit, you can get kind of like a little bend in the middle here. Just adds a little bit more detail. And then I'm going to take this and duplicate it once. This is going to be our first like branch off. There's going to be one main branch here, and then there's going to be a bunch of branch offs. But these are also going to need certain branch offs like this. We're going to go curve to points. And I'm going to go down to 4 because I only want around like 3 segments coming off of it. So we don't want this back point here where this is going to be rotating from. Instance on points, get rid of that center point. Would just be with a color ramp and a noise texture. Just plug the color into the factor and plug the color into the selection. You won't see anything now because we still have to plug in this Bezier. So I'll plug in the Bezier to the instance and just rotate it a bit so we can see what we're doing. And if I invert these color ramp and just bring it back a bit, so that's exactly what we want. Now we have these 3, and I'll just bring in a join geometry 2, just so we can see this original branch. And we're going to use a combine XYZ in a random node for the rotation. So I'll take this combine XYZ and plug it into the rotation, and then take this random value and plug it into the Z here. So you can see if everything's zeroed out, it's all pointing this way. So that's the correct way we want it to. Just needs to be spread out a bit. Just -109 and then 3.4. We'll let all of them kind of branch off in opposite directions. You can put another random value in for the Y. You don't really need it though, but I would just go really low on it, maybe like 0.1. And then this, we can just press Ctrl J and make a section as the branch off. And now we want to instance that on our main branch here. So before that, we're going to want to add some thickness to this main branch. which we already did. This is our setup to add the thickness, but we need something that can actually control the taper of it. So I'm going to use a map range and a spline parameter. Just going to duplicate this map range once. We'll use it later for the actual branch off. Plug the factor into the value, and we can plug the result into the radius for the set curve radius. So if we go back to this node and view it, and see it's upside down. So if you go into the curve and you draw, it's tapering up near the top, which we don't want. This is upside down for the grapes, so I have to invert these two bottom values and just lower this minimum a bit. So it looks like a stem going down. So now we have the thickness for that. I'm going to do instance on points and bring it over on here, and we'll bring the set curve radius into the points. This join geometry for our branch off, we will put on the instance. So you can see now, add a join geometry again and bring it over near the end and bring this curve to mesh, which is the stem. We're going to bring that in here so we can see that too. So the rotation's a bit off. We're going to do somewhat similar, the same that we did for the branches. So I'll use a combine XYZ, bring it in here, connect it to the rotation, and I'm going to use an index. Once we put this on the Z, it should rotate them all away from the original curve. So for the second map range, we're going to plug in this spline parameter into here too. And then this is actually going to be the scale. So plug this result straight into the scale. And you can see it starts to taper now. So again, just like this one, it's going to be inverted. So I'm going to have to invert these ones. So put 1 minimum, 0 to max, and then just adjust the minimum until it looks better. Now you have the branches coming off like that. We can add our sphere or grape back into the scene. And I'll add another instance on points right next to it. We'll do curve to points too. And then this instance on points, so this is each of these little branches that we made. I'm going to bring that to the curved points. Now if you view that, it's going to put points on each segment of that curve. So if you switch this count to 1, it only takes the points of the end of the curve. So that's what we want. So plug those points into the instance on points, plug the geometry or grape into the instance. And then if you view this one, they should all be there. Again, though, the rotation's off. So just take this rotation from the curve to points and put that into the instance rotation. And now they should all rotate out of that curve. So we're going to just drag this grape into the branch off here. And I'm going to plug it into the join geometry. If we view this top join geometry, you should see all the grapes that are spawning on there. So might just need to do a couple adjustments on the scale. So now that everything's put together, it should look like a little bit of a spiral here. The way to make more grapes here would just be turning up this resample curve. So if we bump it up to like 35 maybe, you can see a lot more of these grapes. And then you can play with these settings a bit more too. In some rotation, this X value at 0, they're intersecting each other. So if you turn it down a bit, you can get them to separate. And since nothing's really like actually physical based, there are some that intersect. I'm not sure if there's a way to really get around that other than just separating them a bit more. So what you can also do too, if they're intersecting too much, is you can actually just affect the scale of the actual grape instance itself. We do have the instance of the branches and the grapes being scaled by this map range, but if you scale the actual grapes from where the grapes are being instanced, a bit easier to not get them to intersect. You can just add a few more too with this resample curve, and if you play around with the rotation a bit, you can get a good result. So here, I think this is pretty good for what I'm looking for. These are just the settings. I'll go over them really quickly. I ended up taking out the random value for the Y value here. I just felt like it didn't really need it. So just go with -0.56 for that one. And this Y value too will just have like an opening effect almost. So you can use this when you're growing it. There's a few intersecting in the middle here, which you can fix by rotating them a bit more. It's a lot easier for them to not intersect if you have them kind of pointing up. So this X value can help you. A good rule of thumb too to see if they're in the right orientation is just if you go into this pen editor for the curve and you just click once, they should be in sort of like a spiral like this. So now that we have the grapes instanced and we have the branches have no thickness and it's a little bit basic. It's just kind of going down in a straight line. So you can always change this by changing the actual curve itself, but I'm going to show you guys how to use a noise texture to affect that too. First, we'll need a thickness for the actual branches. So the same thickness profile that we used for the main stem, I'll use that for the branches too. That curve radius, curve circle, and curve to mesh. I'll just copy and paste those down here. I'm just going to move over all this stuff because we'll need some space for this. I'm going to hold shift and right click drag across these two lines here. So we'll take both of those and copy this, paste it twice. We're going to need two thicknesses. You'll see why in a second. So if we just get rid of the grape instance for now, we can see it a bit more. So I'm going to take one of these and bring it into the set curve radius here. Shift over to this node so we can see what's happening on here. And we're going to want to copy this spline parameter and map range over here too. So just plug this map range into the set curve radius and you can see they're each going to get like a tapered thickness. So these are backwards again, so we're going to want to change these, be thicker on the ends, and just copy that over, paste it down in here, and then take that second one and bring it into this curve. Okay, so now we'll just fly over to this curve to mesh, check what's going on here. And if we add a join geometry here, just view both of them. So these secondary branches that are coming off, I want to be a little bit thinner so you're not really seeing like this big gap here. I'll just bring down this value a bit thicker, and then so now we can just take these and press Ctrl J and group them too, and just name them thickness. So we can put that away now. And now we can get rid of this original join geometry that we had. I'm just going to also take all these and press Alt P. That's going to separate them from that group. I'm just going to make a new group for them and name it grape spawn. So we'll take that instance on points and bring it into this join geometry. So now you can see them growing out of those. And affect these values a bit more to make it a bit more realistic. So now I'm going to take this join geometry and plug it into the instances up here, and we can view this top join geometry that shows us all the grapes. It's really just like a matter of balancing it, trying to see which values look good. Okay, so now we have the taper, we have the instances, we have the thickness on these little branches. Just one more thing too, on any curve that you do with the curve to mesh, just click fill caps. Just makes it a bit cleaner. I'll show you guys how to make an end cap on that too. If we just take this top segment here and I'll just group these and name it branch thickness. And we can just pop this back here to make it a bit cleaner. Okay, so now we have our branch offs, our normal branch, our grape spawn, and our thickness. If we add a noise texture, add a vector math, set it to subtract, and then set all these bottom values to 0.5. Just duplicate it and change it to multiply. And if we plug the factor into the value, in the vector into the vector up here. And then if we add a spline parameter too, and we plug the factor into the bottom vector for the multiply, just set position 2 and plug that into this original curve that we made. And we plug this into the offset. It will give that curve, let me just turn off this for now. It'll give the curve a bit of noise. And then if we add a trim curve right after that and play with the end value, you can see it starts to grow on that. So now if everything's together and you try and edit with this trim curve, you can see it goes down and it grows, but the grapes also kind of disappear. Now you can keep this if you want it like this, but it's not really realistic. So the way to fix that would just be, just take this resample curve and duplicate it over here and put it right before this points on instance. And then where we duplicated that from, this original resample curve, change it to length. And something like 0.05 is probably good. It just needs a bit of subdivisions or samples so it's not really pixelated when it's going across this noise. So now you can see when we grow it, all the grapes are staying there and it's following that. So it's a little bit too high for the noise, so I'm going to turn it down to like 1. So just a little bit of wiggle, so you can see without that. If we grow it, it just goes down in a straight line. So you can have it if you want like that. This just adds a little bit more to the animation. And then the count here, you can affect how many grapes you want. So if they're intersecting too much and you want a bit less, or if you want way more grapes, you can put... That's pretty much the base setup. Now it's just a few more things we need to do to make it a bit more realistic and add some more details. Like I said, for the top here, for an end cap, what you can do is take the original curve, which is this Bezier, and just go curve to points. Actually, we'll go from the trim curve to points. And again, if you bring it to 1, there will only be 1 point on the top there. So we can go instance on points. And just for an example, just use a UV sphere. Just put it into the instance here. But it's like 0.05 maybe, something pretty small. And if we add that into the join geometry, view that, now there's going to be something at the top here. So you can add whatever here. For the download in the description, I just used a cube and subdivided it, did a little bit of editing on it to make it look like a stem. You can do something like this and then just use that. Click the rotation from the curve to points and put it to the rotation on instance. And you can go rotate Euler, put it on local, change these values if you want. And so an easy way for animating these values would be using this group input node. If you have some value that you want to animate, like the end value or the scale I'll show you in a second, just drag it over to the group input here and add a math node and set it to multiply. You just drag it in between those and set this bottom value for the multiply to 1. It'll set it back to the original. So now if you change this value, it'll grow it, but it only grows the length. So instead of making a bunch of different values, each thing that you want to change, like adding the scale and adjusting the scale here, you can all affect it by one slider. So just use the multiply and drag it down to the scale as well. I'll just delete this scale. So now you can see if I move this end, where the grapes will grow with the stem. So you can customize this a bit more by using a mix node. If you want, you can just plug this multiply into the factor. And then with these two values, you can adjust the scale. Or if we want this B value to be 1, so when this curve fully gets to the end, it'll only reach that scale. So if you want the grapes to be a little bit bigger by the end of the growth, you can just change this. So even if we want them to be smaller, so maybe I want them 0.5 of the size, they will only grow up to that. When you do play with this slider now though, the grapes are scaling down with the growth, but there's still those little branches that are coming off that aren't really scaling down. We want to go to where all those branches are being instanced. We have the thickness, the grape spawn, and that's going into here, and then it's being instanced right here. So right after that, I'm going to do a scale instances, and we're going to bring over this mix node that's controlling the max scale of these grapes when we grow it. I'm going to drag that over into the scale of this scale instances. So now when it's at its smallest, it's going to have these little nubs that are coming off, and when you grow it to the max, the grapes will grow. So it's an easy way to animate it. So a way to animate some rotation. There's not a really good example here, but let's say we don't have this combine Z here and I want to animate this rotation. You would just plug this in normally, like we did with the growth value, but then you're going to have all these three values. And say you only want to use one of these values, you would just use a combine XYZ and plug it in, and any of these values you could just plug in. So let's say we want this one, so when we grow it, we want it to look like it's kind of opening. I'll just take this Y value and plug it into the group input, and now we have this Y value that we can play with here. So if we give it a quick animation here, frame 1, keyframe both of these, and I'm just going to drag it out to like frame 100 maybe. I'm going to take this Y value and bring it up, and then bring this growth value down to 0. I don't want it to be exactly 0, just so there's a little bit of a start. So now if we press play, it should look like they're growing. There's a couple of them intersecting. Again, it's just a matter of rotating them around until it looks good. So now for the materials, it's pretty simple. You just want to add a set material node. And we'll make a few materials here. We'll make one for the grape. Then we'll make another one for the stem. So we'll just duplicate this. So we'll do grape and stem. You can drag this over right behind the grape spawn, so those have a texture. And then everything else will pretty much just be this material. Just gonna do a little bit more of organizing. So it looks like I'm missing a material right here maybe? Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to go over the materials for the grapes right now really quickly. So I'll have the hex values up on the screen, but this is the material that I have for the grapes individually. So this is the little sphere that we have. So base color, here's the hex value. Subsurface, here's the hex value. Subsurface radius, here's the values for this. I ended up putting the subsurface all the way up. And a little bit of specular down here. Color ramp, I just used a noise texture and a color ramp just to add a little bit of roughness so they're not just completely shiny or dull. Also, when you're doing this, make sure you have the noise texture have a texture coordinate, and then change this to UV. So when they're growing, it's not going to scale the noise texture with it and move. It's all going to stay in the same spot no matter the size of the grapes. So it's the same for the stem too. Just make sure you have the noise textures with the UV attached. So for the branches, I just used the same technique as the grapes almost, with just a noise texture and a color ramp, and added some brownish yellow hues. And one more thing about the UVs, in the GeoNodes, if you just copy this setup, we have a capture attribute, set it to float and point, and bring in a curve to mesh. Put that to the right, just duplicate the copy attribute and bring it below it. Bring in a spline parameter and plug them both into the value. And the curve circle, if you plug that into geometry and just add a combine XYZ and only plug these in the same way. If you take after the set curve radius that we have for the branch, so the main stem branch, this isn't the same project. I kind of deleted the old file, but this is just the branch thickness that we have. If you remember, we have these two map ranges here. So top map range that's controlling the thickness of that branch, it goes into the set curve radius. I'm not going to use this curve to mesh right now, so I'm just going to delete it, and I'm just going to use this curve circle. So if you plug in this set curve radius into the capture attribute here, and then this vector that comes out here, the X and the Y, if you just plug that into the group output over here and give it a UV name. So I just named it grape UV over here. And then when you go into the actual texture of your stem overview of it, I have a noise texture, some green and brown hues, and then I just adjusted the hue and saturation on here a bit. And here's some of the settings, a little bit of metallic, a little bit more roughness so it's not super shiny, and then just another noise texture controlling the bump map, just so we have these little bumps. So if you add a map range or you just control T on any of these, it's going to bring up this texture coordinate. You just delete this red texture coordinate and keep the mapping node, and then add in an attribute and just copy the name that you have over here for the attribute and put it into the name down here and plug the color into the vector. And now the UV won't change, because otherwise if you don't do this and you just have it as a normal noise texture, when the curve grows, the noise is going to change with it, and it doesn't really look like it's the same object. It's like the texture's moving over top of the object. If we add in the UV here, the texture will grow with the curve and not separately. So this is the only way that I know that you can use UVs on curves and geonodes. So the texture that I used for these little branch offs is the same texture as the stem. It's just a bit more yellow on the hue for the color ramp. It's the same idea though, just noise textures and color ramps to affect all this stuff. So that was pretty much the whole tutorial for the grapes. In the downloadable grapes too, there's just a few more things that I added that are not really needed to go over in the tutorial, but it's pretty much using the exact same methods in the same group as the grape spawn. I just added a little modeled end cap here for the beginning of the grapes. I just used instance on points and scaled them until it looked like they were at the end of the grape here. Adds a little bit more than just a normal cutoff like this. And then also at the top, I just added a leaf, which is generated through Midjourney, and then just a stem coming off too. So this has some rotation and some turning for it. So that's pretty much the whole GeoNodes tutorial. If you guys have any questions, just throw them in the comments and I'll try and answer them. And I'll see you guys in the next video.